So it sounds like we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the Weissman Center Cerebral Palsy Day with the Experts. I'm Dr. Melissa Villegas, the Cerebral Palsy Clinic Director here at the Weissman Center. We were really pleased to be able to offer a Day with the Experts again this year after not holding one last year. So welcome to everyone virtually from wherever you're signing in. We have a really exciting, I think, lineup today with our speaker and then our family panel. I don't have a lot else to say from a start standpoint, so I think we'll go ahead and start with introductions of our speaker. So I'm pleased to introduce this year's featured speaker, Dr. Bernadette Gillig. Dr. Gillick is an associate professor in the Division of Developmental Pediatrics and Rehabilitation Medicine here at the University of Wisconsin, and she's built her career as a neuroscientist and a pediatric physical therapist. Her research focuses on understanding how the brain of the child both develops and recovers after early injury and diagnosis of cerebral palsy, and she's won numerous research awards, including most recently this year's American Academy of Cerebral Palsy and Developmental Medicine Mentorship Award. So we're so thrilled that she joined our division here at UW. Please help me give a warm welcome to Dr. Gillick.
Thank you. I very much appreciate that. Very, very warm welcome. And I'm very excited to talk with all of you. I'm looking forward to the discussion after my talk. And please feel free to ask questions and put them in the chat, as I hope that this is a really interactive morning in terms of what we're talking about here. So I'm going to share my screen. And these are reflections that I have in terms of advancing research in cerebral palsy over the last 3 decades of my work, both as a physical therapist and then most recently the decade and a half as a neuroscientist working in research with people who have cerebral palsy and the families and caregivers who support them. And so, as was just mentioned, I come from the University of Wisconsin, and I also am the director of the Pediatric Neuromodulation Laboratory at the Weissman Center. So I'll talk about specifically what that is. I also wanted to make mention in this, just to recognize that Wisconsin is home to 11 federally recognized tribes, Native American tribes, and University of Wisconsin-Madison rests on the ancestral home of the Ho-Chunk. And yesterday was a very unique day. It was the first time in the history of the University of Wisconsin-Madison that they showed respect to another nation by flying the Ho-Chunk flag alongside with the US and Wisconsin state flags. And I also have a very concerted interest in maternal and infant health in Native American and Native Alaskan populations. So I wanted to make mention of that. In terms of our laboratory, I want to thank all of our funding. We have funding from international funding, and I'm very grateful for that. We combine in our laboratory using neuromodulation, which is a way to either measure brain activity or influence brain activity, with neuroimaging, taking pictures of the brain, looking at how the brain is connected, looking at the structures of the brain, and then neurorehabilitation. So doing therapy with kids as well. So we integrate what we know about the brain with what we know about how to actually influence activity and try to look at how we could potentially change function for individuals who have cerebral palsy. So our lab motto is empowering children for life. We work with infants all the way through adults who have had early injury to their brain and cerebral palsy. So a very unique population and a very unique opportunity to combine what we're doing with therapies and looking at new and novel interventions that can be advanced therapies in the future. So I really am appreciative of the fact that today I'm talking to a group of individuals who have a knowledge of cerebral palsy. And in terms of just a few bullet points, when I'm thinking about who are the people with whom we are working, I think about the fact that early injury to the brain, such as stroke, is a common cause of cerebral palsy. And that secondary diagnosis of cerebral palsy can happen early or even later in an individual's life. And by later, I mean up to 2 to 3 years after they were born. It's one of the most common motor disabilities and is the most common motor disability in childhood. And it costs money to care for us as individuals. But as individuals with cerebral palsy, up to $1 million lifetime cost of care. So it's something that is worth looking at in terms of how could we influence the cost of care and improve the lives of the individuals with whom we're working in research and clinic. So the pictures at the right-hand side are MRI images, and those are 30 participants in our studies, kids with cerebral palsy, and they have all different brain structures and different types of injury to their brain. So each one of those individuals has their own unique type of stroke or early brain injury and unique ways that cerebral palsy influences their lives. And so we look at that for each individual who is involved with us in research. And so when I think about cerebral palsy, I think about the kids that we've worked with, babies, infants, and they're starting their lives with an early injury to their brain, and they're still developing. And so there's all these different ways that they present themselves. So these kids go on to be these people as they're growing up. And so they're people with cerebral palsy. But when I look at these individuals and when I sit and when our team works with these individuals, we think of them as people, of course, people who are going to go on to do different things and want to do different things with their lives. And specifically, these particular individuals have gone on to be people who have done different things, become musicians, technicians, graphic designers, part of a marching band, and kids who want to play. So we're continually developing. So that's our goal, is to actually look at these people and say, what are we doing? How are we working with individuals? And how do we make a difference in their lives? So one thing I'm thinking about when we talk about cerebral palsy is, and our work, are there early unique signs or markers of development and recovery after an early injury to the brain that reveals a really high risk of developing cerebral palsy? So are there any unique markers that will actually tell us, hey, this individual might develop cerebral palsy? And the other question is, can the activity of the brain be further influenced to change the ability of people with cerebral palsy to move beyond current treatment options? So is there something that we can still do to try to influence what's happening with a child's brain? So like I mentioned, we use this form of non-invasive brain stimulation. We use it two ways. We can use it to actually understand how active the brain is. So we can do these pulses of energy, a click on the outside of the scalp, painless, very short in duration, that allows us to see what's the connectivity between the brain and maybe a hand muscle, and measure that signal and the strength of that signal. And then the other thing we can do is try to use brain stimulation in ways that will intervene or influence brain activity or excitability. So we can actually use two different forms, magnetic stimulation or transcranial direct stimulation, as interventions. And you're seeing the picture on the upper right, that's the brain stimulator. We're working with an adolescent who has the ability to show us what the activity of the brain is. And on the lower right, we actually have a child who was involved in one of our summer camps for 3 weeks, working intensively with constraint-induced therapy, really encouraging use of his weaker hand at the same time that he was receiving brain stimulation. So I want to tell you a story. The story is about a young woman whose name is Eva. And Eva received one of our flyers in the mail about our research. And she lived in northern Minnesota, and she had cerebral palsy. She was born with an early injury to the brain, and she has cerebral palsy. So she actually contacted us and talked to me before she even told me that she was interested in participating in our research. She told us about how she wanted to understand what we understood about her having cerebral palsy. And so actually, she and I wrote an article that we published together about her journey in terms of having cerebral palsy. So I'm going to share a couple excerpts of what she wrote and the discussions that we had and the things that I learned from Eva in terms of our research. So we published in a journal called the Journal of Humanities and Rehabilitation. And this is what she said. She said, I've never known what it's like to grow up or live life where everything functions normally, or know what that even means. I know what congenital hemiparesis means. And after years and years of therapy, I know that I am my own normal. So when a researcher is recruiting me for a study, which aims to, and this is what I wrote, improve function in children with congenital hemiparesis, that form of cerebral palsy, I asked, what do you mean by improve my function? Is there something that needs improving about me? Or aren't I already doing well in this body that has served me my whole life? So I didn't survive or I didn't suffer a stroke. I survived it and I even thrive. And it was a really important moment for me when she said, what do you mean you're going to improve my function? And this has really built a lot of the studies that we do in our laboratory in working with kids with cerebral palsy and using neuromodulation, neuroimaging, and neurorehabilitation. So one big study that we did to get more information about how are the things that we're doing in our research perceived is we built a study along with Dr. Tanzila Naushin, looking at the perception of families and specifically parents and caregivers and why they would actually enroll their children in studies that are perceived high risk, so that have neuromodulation, brain stimulation. And so we brought this study to the state fair in Minnesota, and we asked and queried all of these different individuals who are parents and caregivers as to what their thoughts were about this type of research. So it was a survey at the Minnesota State Fair. People had to be parents or caregivers or wanted to become parents. And there's questions specifically about the research that we were doing. Minnesota State Fair is the largest state fair in the United States with the largest number of people that come every day to the state fair. So we had a really good population to actually query and see who might be interested in this. So we had 650 different parents or caregivers or people who wanted to be parents and were looking forward to being parents included. 622 completed this online and iPad format questionnaire. And so we were able to break down to the 416 parents and then divide the parents of a child who's developing typically and the parents of a child with a disability. And this is what we found from this study. We found that participants, meaning these parents and caregivers, chose health benefit and the evidence of safety, respectively, as really important factors to involve children in research. So those were big ticket items for them in terms of why they would actually involve their children in research. They also, when given the choice of looking at all different ways that we could term non-invasive brain stimulation, they said that non-invasive brain therapy was perceived as the least risky option. So if we talked about non-invasive brain stimulation, we talked about it as a potential therapy. That was the perception that it was the least risky. We also, and I found this very interesting, we also found that parents of a child with a disability were more likely to involve children in research than those who had typically developing children. So actually the people who had a child with a disability looked at this as an opportunity to involve their children in research and potentially vary the outcomes. So this really helped us in terms of understanding what's happening with different families and the caregiver perception. And we went on to earlier actually learn from this and continue to integrate this. So when I was getting my PhD in neuroscience and rehabilitation science, we were awarded an Obama stimulus package NIH challenge grant. And the grant combined the use of constraint-induced therapy, which I mentioned before, which is actually restraining or casting or putting in a sling, a stronger arm if an individual has cerebral palsy that affects one side of their body, and it encourages them to use their weaker arm. So this photo on the left shows the individual. He has a cast on an arm that doesn't have a broken bone, but actually is restraining his stronger arm. So his weaker side, his right side, is actually working on things like drawing or other activities. So we combined that constraint-induced therapy with non-invasive brain stimulation. And we altered every day doing the brain stimulation and the constraint-induced therapy. This is funded by a number of different types of funding agencies. And it was done started at Seattle Children's, where I was working clinically, and also at Gillette Children's Specialty Healthcare in the Twin Cities. And we did this out of the University of Minnesota. So what did we find from this? Well, interesting, if I can use some fancy graphs, we found here in this particular study that kids actually improved hand function more in a group that had the real brain stimulation with the constraint-induced therapy, as opposed to a sham or a mock brain stimulation. So this graph actually shows a scale called the assisting hand assessment. And that was where we saw significant differences between the two groups, is that this scale showed us that the use of hands together showed a significant differences in improvement. We also saw in this study that in a bunch of other assessments, so looking at something called the Canadian Occupational Performance Measure, and also how strong their hand was in terms of the force generation and how they were able to detect different, through using their sensory system, detect different items, that everybody improved. So by doing constraint-induced therapy, it looked like that helped them as well. And this was a pretty intensive type of intervention. It was 2 weeks that they worked with us. So kids improved, and the kids that got the real brain stimulation improved more, specifically on these type of tasks, where they were actually doing tasks together with both hands. So once the cast was off and the hands were working together, they actually showed some improvement above and beyond those kids who did not get the real brain stimulation. The other thing about talking to children and talking to families is looking at how did they perceive the brain stimulation in terms of any adverse events or side effects. So how did they perceive that was? And what we found was that the highest types of adverse events or feedback that we received from the participants is that they had a very transient headache. Some of them had a very transient headache that went away within an hour, and the cast was irritating. So for a lot of these kids, having the cast on was irritating in and of itself. We also found that kids who had the sham or mock brain stimulation also complained of headaches. And so we had to really listen to how are kids perceiving what we're doing in this research, and what is it actually feeling like to them, and how can we make that a better experience? We also went back and looked and asked these kids and families 2 to 4 years later, how are you doing? How are things going? So we really wanted to make sure that their status, their functional status, was continuing to improve, which it did in the majority of kids, and also that there were no adverse events related to the brain stimulation, and there were not. So we were very happy to find out that kids did well and were continuing to develop and grow. The other thing we did is talk to the kids. So these are really important moments for me as a researcher, to actually have the time to sit with children who have participated and sit with parents and caregivers who have participated and say, what did you think? What did you think about the study? And would you do it again? And this is the feedback that we got, that on a scale of 0 to 10, with the kids that had the real brain stimulation, about a 7.2 out of 10 were satisfied with participating, and about 8.9 in the kids that were in the mock or sham brain stimulation group. We also asked them, would you do it again? Would you re-enroll in the study? And about 88% of the kids and 86% said, yeah, I would actually come back. And this was a 2-week study, a really big, dedicated, every day coming in study. So we were pretty excited about that too. The last question we asked is, if you knew another child with cerebral palsy, would you recommend that they come do the research with us? And 100% of them said, absolutely, I'd recommend this to someone else. So very exciting for us. Something that we also learned from this, and this is called a Consort Diagram. It really gives us a layout of from the beginning of the study all the way to who participated in the study. How did we do? So there's a lot of little words in here, but this is what I want to show you, is that we started with 203 individuals who were interested in participating in the study. And we ended up with 19 participating for different reasons. They were excluded because it might not have been perfectly fit for their child, the time constraints, distance, things like that. So the return on investment there is different in terms of, we started with 203 families we were having discussions with, and we were involved with 19. So it gave me the opportunity to take a step back and say, so how can we align looking at those people who are interested and those people who enroll and try to improve our numbers? And we do that by learning real feedback from real children and real families and caregivers in terms of what we can do better with our research. And so we continue to try to promote our research and talk to families, talk to parents, talk to caregivers, talk to children, and find out what could we do. And a lot of this stuff actually was able to be published in PBS NewsHour, in the Star Tribune in the Twin Cities and beyond. And I'll show you a couple of these things. But we actually, in having those conversations, were able to connect even more with our community. So we did this through town halls, we did this through focus polls, we did this through ice cream socials, and we're able to actually sit and say, what's going on and what do you think? So we did another study after this, and we used a different form of brain stimulation, pretty similar type of construct as the last one, where we constrained the stronger arm and actually moved and worked with the more affected arm. And these kids again came to us and they worked with us for 3 weeks every day, doing intensive therapy and brain stimulation at the same time. And so this was also funded by the National Institutes of Health, along with the Cerebral Palsy Foundation and the Foundation for Physical Therapy. So an important study, follow-up study, and this form of brain stimulation was easier to use. It had fewer side effects that we had heard about before the study, and that we were able actually to use it in conjunction at the same time as restraining the arm. So as many of you know, there is this construct of how the brain controls movement, where the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body and the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. And so we think about this a lot when we're working with kids who have early injury to the brain that might affect which side of the brain is actually still moving or active towards the movement of a hand. And if there's interruption to what's happening in the brain, does that change? And so we actually have found this using brain stimulation. So here's 2 kids with whom we work, and you can see in the upper panel that there's a large area that's affected by that early brain injury, and a little bit smaller area in the lower pictures. 2 different individuals, 2 different injuries to the brain. When we use brain stimulation, those pulses of energy to actually do a little click and actually measure how does that signal travel down, and there's some sort of influence or response in the hand, we found that with some kids, we don't get a response from the side of the brain that is connected on the other side. So there's not this connectivity that we can measure using our tools from the side of the brain that's injured to the opposite side. But we found that on the side of the brain that's not injured, when we clicked, it actually moved both hands. So we were actually able to pick up a signal from both hands. So it looked as though the brain had this plastic component, this neuroplasticity that allowed for movement generation from one side, the side that wasn't as injured, for both hands. So that's pretty interesting to measure. As you can see, okay, the side of the brain that's not injured actually is moving both hands. And some kids, even with early brain injury, still retained that crossed right brain to left hand, left brain to right hand type of integrity. So really important for us to try to measure those things and to understand, is there a difference between how the children with one form of brain integrity or circuitry, as we call it, respond to these interventions as opposed to the other? So something that we started asking about. And in that particular study, we actually found that with all of this, and I use a lot of fancy terms here in one of our figures, but with all of this, with that type of brain stimulation, that type of constraint-induced therapy, we found that the kids who actually retained right side of the brain to the left hand, left side of the brain to the right hand, did better in that study than those kids that had one side of the brain that was controlling both hands. So really interesting for us to see who responds to that type of brain stimulation. Everybody's different. We're all looking at different individuals. So those kids, and this is what we call a contralateral circuitry, this little gray picture is our brain stimulator. And if there is some sort of brain lesion, early brain lesion that's still there, we still were able to find a signal in the more affected hand on that side. Or maybe we weren't, and we actually had to go to the side of the brain that actually had no injury. And that side of the brain may actually control that more affected hand as well. What else did we learn? Really important for us to actually sit down and ingest and listen to the people with whom we work. So this is a word brain map that one of my earlier PhD students made. And it really looked at what was the feedback that we received during these studies. What were kids feeling or thinking or telling us that was really important to them about what they did and what they experienced in the research? And we definitely integrated these things into future studies that we've done and are still doing in terms of how to construct the best study we can to be able to work with these individuals and be able to get some interesting information in terms of how we can move forward. So back to Eva. So the story that I have with Eva, she went on to explain more then about what it was of being in a research study with us as an individual who has cerebral palsy and brain injury really early in her life. So she didn't want us to go on to use the word improve, as I didn't think they understood what that means to a young person who has dealt with a stroke her whole life. Improve means to me that I am not currently functioning at my full potential or giving it all I've got. I have grown up knowing that I can accomplish anything I set my mind to, although the frustration of having to take a lot longer than a normal, in quotes, her word, person always lingers in my mind. Having hemiparesis, weakness on one side of the body, makes grasping any sort of small object one of the biggest daily challenges I can face. So the simplest of tasks becomes one of the hardest obstacles I have to overcome. And that is the construct of our studies, is how can we work on helping improve? No, look at, change, adapt, and try to tailor what the individual is concerned about, what their goals are, to what our goals are in trying to intervene with brain stimulation. And so again, we went back and looked at who can we talk to about this and how can we disseminate this word? This is from KARE 11 News, a study that we did now in infants. So we actually started to look at the time frame of infancy early on, closer to when they actually had the early brain injury. So this was a study that was also funded by the National Institutes of Health. And we started to take individuals, infants, take pictures of their brain, measure the brain connectivity when they're very young, between the ages of 0 and 2 years old, and then look also at how are they moving early on as babies and how that might influence their function as well. So we have a bunch of publications about that. We actually had great interest from the physical therapy community as well. This was actually on the cover of Pediatric Physical Therapy, the study that we were doing. So upper left, you remember this adolescent that we were doing brain stimulation with? We started to do brain stimulation with babies and up to 2 years old. And so we found some really interesting results from that too, because we're trying to look at a time that, again, younger individuals are both developing and recovering. So I go back to this, what we were talking about before. We were trying to measure if we're actually looking at that pulse of energy, can we define what it looks like to actually be in one group versus the other? And that might be really evident if a person has a stroke and that has influenced an entire hemisphere, like on the left, but it might not be so evident when we're working with an individual where the stroke might have affected a smaller area. So what did we find in these infants? We found that brain stimulation did actually detect connectivity in infants. So those younger ages, we were able to use the brain stimulator safely, comfortably, and we were actually able to map out, can we get a signal from these hemispheres? We also found that there was primarily no signal from the injured hemisphere in these infants, and that if they didn't have a signal, if there's no signal, it was potentially related to a high risk of developing cerebral palsy. So that gives us some sort of idea of maybe we can use this as a tool to indicate what's going on with cerebral palsy. So one of the families told us in our feedback that more information is never a bad thing. Learn more, why not participate? And here's actually the individual who was in the neonatal intensive care unit. She's looking down at herself. She's now 2 years old, and she's saying, okay, got more information. So we're involved with these individuals that give us feedback about how did the study go and did that help them to understand what was happening. So new frontiers for our laboratory. We are just embarking at Weizmann, very excited about this National Institutes of Health R01 study that we're doing. So we've got a nice amount of funding to actually look at children, infants, early on through the first 2 years of life at 4 different time points. So at 4 different time points to be able to say, how are they doing? So we can do the brain stimulation, we can take pictures of their brain using neuroimaging and follow how they are moving or their motor development and the potential of cerebral palsy diagnosis. So we're looking for individuals to be involved in this study, and we're actually looking at team with families and infants to look at how they are developing and recovering at the same time. We'll be doing that at the University of Wisconsin and recruiting nationwide and actually also worldwide for those who are interested. The other study that we're doing is we're doing a study in the home where we're actually using the brain stimulation, but we're actually communicating remotely. So we're practicing for a couple of sessions with family online, and then we're there with the family online again and using the brain stimulator actively as we move forward. Okay, so what have we learned? Summary of lessons learned from the caregiver and child real feedback throughout my career thus far. One is recruitment doesn't end when the caregiver or the child express interest. So when those teams call you and say, we're interested, we have to actually create a relationship. And it's a great opportunity to actually be involved with the community and say, okay, we're glad that you're interested. That doesn't commit you to participating in the research. It opens the door to communication and to start to have that type of relationship in looking at how is your child recovering and developing. So having a team that's pediatric based is really key. So having these fantastic physicians with whom I work, the other therapists with whom I work, and my team in my research laboratory is really important, because for us to understand what it is to work with children is really important to families and children. The principal investigator, meaning me as the director of the laboratory, or an expert, needs to be directly involved. So we found from families that they want to see the whites of our eyes. They want to know that we're involved, that we understand what we're doing, and that we can explain what our research is about to families to actually help them in the future. Recruitment takes valuable time and effort, which is valuable to the study, to the caregiver, and the child. It's not something to actually take lightly. Recruitment is the most important part of the study beyond safety, to actually say, we're creating a relationship with you, and we want to know how best to do that. Our second lesson is that the recruitment doesn't end when the caregiver and the child are enrolled. So let's say a family says, yes, we want to be enrolled. We were excited to be in your research. That's the opportunity to continue that relationship, to continue to learn, and to continue to talk and communicate to each other. So plan optimally. When's the best time for a family to be involved in the study? Is it in the evenings? Is it on the weekends? Is it during holidays? Can we plan for illness for these children? Can we plan for school and all the wonderful things that they're involved in, including therapies, and try to make sure that it works well for the family? Make sure that the environment is welcoming, such as the Wiseman Center, that really understands the families need to have easy access to be able to understand where they're going and to make it as smooth as possible. And clinician researchers need to spend time with the participant. We always talk about how the child is the center of our team. So the coach, the leader of our team, so that we're really gearing these studies towards what does the child need and where do they want to go. I want to give an example of the study that I talked about early on from that Obama stimulus package. We had kids come in for 14 sessions, every participant. That means families and caregivers are bringing these kids in for 14 sessions. That's a big study, and not all of our studies are that big of a commitment, but back then it was a big commitment. So that means there were actually 262 total sessions across all of the participants, in that study. How many people missed a session? 0. So 262 sessions, and no one missed any of the sessions. It's pretty exciting because actually it tells us that we were able to communicate well with the families. We understood what they needed. We were flexible to their needs. We were able to get the data that we needed to actually look at what are we learning. The other thing is that with brain stimulation, the possibility of an adverse event should be considered a probability. We have never had an adverse event, a serious adverse event in our laboratory, and I'm pleased to say that. But we also prepare very well for that. So we understand how to actually work with individuals and be able to try to make sure that they feel as though that we know what we're doing, we understand the risks, we know actually how to ask for feedback and when and why. And we also know how to actually ask a child for feedback in the ways that they understand how to give us that feedback. And then from whom? Also asking the caregivers and the participants, the families, the parents, what type of feedback can they give us? The most important lesson that we have is also to listen. So this is some feedback that we got from one of the individuals in our study. Thanks for letting me in the study. The MRI was fun. The TMS, meaning the brain stimulation, was fun too. But the therapy was the most fun. I love these pictures. So to this child, actually being able to work with us in therapy for that study was the most important piece. And that gives us a lot of information. And we also have actually as well information sessions. I'll just play a quick video for you here. So I'm going to stop there for a second, but they're giving us feedback, and those sessions are videotaped, and we go through and actually analyze what are they telling us about what they perceived and how does it work. And those are really important sessions. So last slide from Eva. This was her opportunity to share the last piece of information with us from which we could learn. As a person living with stroke her whole life, I've been grateful for the guidance I have received from therapists and researchers. But remember, please don't think that my function is something you need to improve. I did not suffer a stroke. I survived one. I am normal because this is who I am and who I have always been. And it's a huge piece of information for us in terms of this is the individual and her life, and how do we work with what her goals may be, and exploring other ways to continue to develop with her. My last statement here is a plea for caution. I mentioned this before, but safety in our laboratory is of paramount importance. These children are vulnerable, they are developing, and they are recovering, and everything we do is geared towards safety. We use our skills, our intellect, our dedicated energies to make sure that we keep everyone safe in our studies. And we look in terms of understanding how we are doing that worldwide throughout all of our different activities through different laboratories and collaborations. I want to thank my team. I want to thank the collaborators with whom I work and the current funding, and the team that has actually worked with me from the very beginning. So my core team is listed here at the photographs, and my team on the right of all of this work that has been done has largely been done by the people with whom I work. And so I'm very grateful. I want to say thank you very much to the participants and the families who are the central part and the most key to what we do. Thank you very much.
So I think we have time for some questions. If anyone has questions, feel free to enter them in the chat. Teresa, I don't know if we have the ability to unmute people if they have questions otherwise.
The chat, we can't unmute them, but they can put questions in the chat.
Perfect, thank you. I actually have a question to start off. If families were interested in learning more or in participating in your research, how would they go about looking into that?
Thank you very kindly. So we have a website. So in terms of our pediatric neuromodulation laboratory, we have a website that you can go on. It has all the different ways to contact us. It has our current studies. So if you looked up Weisman and Pediatric Neuromodulation Laboratory, or just my name, Bernadette Gillick, you'll find the link to it. I really appreciate that question, because half of what we're doing is not enrolling people in our studies, but actually trying to have a conversation. So if there's something that you want us to know or understand about what it's like to be on the side of trying to discern if you want to be involved in research, or talking about what the journey is with your family and your child, we like to have those conversations from the very beginning to, first of all, learn from you, but also to try to see if any of our research studies would fit. So we just make sure that we're talking about the fact that there's no obligation to participate in our research, but it's what we do is we have a conversation, and we really look forward to that. So thank you for that question.
We have another question from Janet Laguerre, who says, fabulous talk. How young are you starting interventions in your studies?
That's a great question. So if I divide that out, all of the different slides that I just showed talked about studies that either are doing intervention or studies that are looking or observing in terms of how early brain injury actually can affect recovery and development. So for the infants in our studies, we are doing more of observing what is happening over the first 2 years. For children who had an early brain injury, we've actually been doing interventions or looking for certain types of therapies from the age of 6 all the way into adulthood in 21. So we're not doing early intervention in babies and infants yet, but we're looking to do that in the future once we can learn more. So thank you very much for that question.
Excellent, thank you. We have another question from Ann Hacker, who asks, what do you hope to research in the next 2 to 5 years? Also, would you ever do research in collaboration with adults with cerebral palsy?
Great questions. Thank you, Anne. I appreciate those. So in the next 2 to 5 years, we're trying to do a couple specific studies, the ones I mentioned at the end. So we're actually trying to do that 2-year, over the first 2 years of life, longitudinal study. So actually where we're looking at brain recovery and development to see how does a baby's brain develop at the same time they recover, and find out if we can understand more about what tells us they're going to develop cerebral palsy or not. The other study, what we're doing, is the one we're doing in the home setting for older kids who had early brain injury when they were infants, but actually being able to use the brain stimulator at home with their parents, with supervision with us safely. And that's an intervention study. That's looking at, can we look at the influence on brains, on hand function in using the brain stimulator. The second part of that question, so what are we doing over the first 2 years? And can you remind me what the second part of that question is?
Would you ever do research in collaboration with adults with CP?
Yes. So we actually do research in collaboration with adults with cerebral palsy. So a lot of the studies that we've done have gone all the way up to the age of 21. And what we'd like to do, if our motto truly is empowering children for life, it's looking at, can that actually have an influence in people who have cerebral palsy in adulthood as well? So we've got, in collaboration with one of our colleagues, Kathleen Friel out on the East Coast, we're looking at trying to develop this type of brain stimulation and therapy intervention for people who have cerebral palsy in adulthood as well.
Thank you.
Yes.
Trina Muich asks, do you work with children with quadriplegia or just hemiparesis?
That's a great question. Thank you so much. So actually, we work with children with all types of cerebral palsy. The earlier studies were mainly in hemiparesis so that we could make that specific type of construct in terms of understanding one hemisphere versus the other. This infant study that we're doing is looking at all different forms of early brain injury and the development of cerebral palsy. So what we're hoping to do is actually expand these findings into other types of cerebral palsy and people who have different diagnoses as well. So it's not just children with hemiparesis.
Thank you. Lauren Fesco says, wonderful talk. Thank you so much. And then Jennifer asks, do you work with occupational therapists in your research studies?
So I have learned more from occupational therapists than I can ever wish for. I'm so excited about that, because a lot of what I can do is study the hand. And a big reason that I study a lot of hand function is because with our brain stimulator, we can get to the area of the brain that controls the hand. And so we have actually had an occupational therapist, at least one, if not 5, involved with us from the very start. So it's not only physical therapy, it's occupational therapy as well as speech therapy that come together in terms of looking at all the different ways an individual can potentially change in terms of their function. And that's the exciting part, is that we get to work with all different people. So we're looking forward to continuing that relationship with occupational therapy. And I really learn a lot from them in terms of what we can do.
Thank you. Janet Laguerre says, wonderful talk and good collaboration. Is there any data in other models that TMS may be beneficial in young brains relatively soon after injury?
So Janet's question, Janet is a seasoned researcher and very experienced here at the University of Wisconsin, which is exciting to have these questions coming from her. I think that's a really important point that I could do better to describe, is that a lot of this work is based on early studies in rodent models, so like a rat model, and also in primates. And that has helped us to actually continue to build what we're doing in humans safely and be able to look at what are we doing in terms of understanding brain development. So yes, actually, a lot of this work was built on the rat model, and it's built in terms of looking at other areas of the brain as well that have been affected or that are actually part of the intervention. And those models have shown us that there are some things that we need to be very careful about. You can do brain stimulation in terms of an intervention too early. It actually might interrupt growth. And those are similar to studies in neuroplasticity, that type of change of the brain. You can also do too much. You can do too little. And those are really important studies that help us to see how should we dose what we're doing and how do we move forward with integrating brain stimulation. So thank you for that question, Janet, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. I think that's all the questions we have right
Wonderful.
now. Thank you again so much, Dr. Gillick.
Thank you all so much. And I really appreciate you being here on Saturday morning and this opportunity. So I appreciate it. Thank you. Bye-bye. I'm here in the background.
Excellent, thank you. So I think we are going to then move forward with our community panel. So we have 3 different participants that are various numbers of parents and kids and young adults, I should say. And so I think I will go ahead and start by having them introduce themselves. And I will, I think, have maybe the Hawkins family, since they are first on my screen, introduce themselves first, and feel free to unmute and turn on video if you'd like.
Hi, I'm Kathy Hawkins.
And I'm Brian Hawkins.
Our son Jonathan, CP, and he has written his answers to questions. So,
And he's 18 years old at this time.
Excellent, thank you. Next, I will have Jazz and Martha Ceravo introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Martha Ceravo. My daughter Jasmine is 1 and she's in the background singing right now. So I'm sure she'll jump in and say hi very shortly.
Excellent, thank you. And then there's Anthony and Alberta Hagan also.
Oops, Alberta, you just need to unmute. Sorry.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Alberta, and my son is 15 and he has CP.
Excellent, thank you all. So, sorry, my dog is barking in the background. You can hear him.
We all love a good dog bark, right? Everyone needs to be able to hear their voice.
They do like to share their voices too. Sorry about that. So one of our first questions that we have is, if you'd like to share just when you first noticed some differences in your child's development and what the diagnostic process was like for you in receiving the diagnosis of cerebral palsy.
With Az, he suffered a brain injury at birth, so the whole process was quite a shock, and trying to process it all, with everybody in the hospital, it was a lot to deal with, but we just had to take it one day at a time. And I think once we came out of the hospital and was introduced to the Weissman Center, it was a breath of fresh air for us, because then you could talk to people who really understood, people who are familiar with handling kids in situations like that. And so we were able to get, for lack of better choice of words, I'd say realistic feedback, feedbacks that made sense. Because I think in the hospital, they were thinking that we were thinking that, everything is going to be okay. But at the Weissman Center, they were able to give us a clearer picture that, this is what you're looking at, this is what could happen. So it was more of, we're here with you throughout the journey than being forced to make decisions that, you didn't want to make. So it was really helpful, switching from the hospital to the Weissman Center.
Thank you, Alberta.
for us, we too, our son had a birth. He was shoulder dystocia along with having the cord wrapped. So again, like your experience with your son, it was in the hospital. Things were happening, very quickly, very unlike any other birth, we basically knew, of course, right away that there was something wrong. There's no muscle tone. He's not waking up. For us living in a smaller community, When we left the hospital, then we were hooked up with a home health nurse for a while, and then birth to 3. So a lot of our knowledge came from birth to 3.
Thank you.
I can jump on there too. So with Jazz, I forgot to say she does a cerebral palsy, but she has a grade. She was born at 27 weeks and 5 days, so very early. And again, has spent 81 days in the NICU, and that was a long process. A lot going on at that time, and there was just a lot to take in. It's very overwhelming. And even like think 3 months, we were even set up to go to the Wiseman Center at the very end of our visit, straight from there. And again, there's a lot of people in that room. I found there's so much to take in during the first year, and there's a lot of changes and sometimes surgeries and other things going on. So there's a lot of processing, but I think being connected to the Wiseman Center early on helped bring in more experts than us trying to make guesses along the way, and just kind of have some milestones and someone to collaborate with.
Thank you, everyone. I want to talk just a little bit about kind of your experiences with inclusion, and maybe at times when you've seen success with that in the community or with school, and maybe times that you've had challenges and how you potentially approach those challenges.
I think for us, I'll say with my son, he's totally dependent on all his cares. And so community-wise, I don't think we experienced a lot of challenges because, because he has respiratory issues as well. So he's very high risk. So we were very strategic in terms of where we took him. I'd say mostly it would be family events or close-knit events. So it wasn't that bad. But the biggest challenge was doctor's appointments. It was the hardest part, I'd say the first 2-3 years, was having to explain, having to retell your story every time somebody walked into the room. So at that point, you kept asking yourself, did they actually read his file and realize that his injury was based during delivery? Like, it happened during delivery. It's not something that I did. So you could, like, there were some feedbacks that, some comments that I got that it was like I did something wrong. There was one time that someone passed a comment that, what kind of medications were you on? And I knew the subtle implication of what that meant, but I ignored it. So after a while, I realized, no, I had to take control of it. So each time they came in and they started asking me questions to relive it, then I would ask them, did you go through his file before coming in? Because I'd appreciate it if you do that before you walk in. And after I did that, it stopped. But occasionally you still have those challenges, where it's like you're trying to tell them, your kid the best. So when you're trying to provide that information, sometimes you have that challenge, like you don't know what you're talking about. And after a while where he stopped going into the hospital for a very long period of time, that's when they realized that, oh, mom must be doing something right. So then that stopped, and they started appreciating all our inputs when it comes to his cares. But then when you come to the Wiseman Center, it was totally different. So at a point in time, I started referring them to the Wiseman Center, that you can talk to his team at the Wiseman Center, and so that helped a little bit. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing. I can't imagine how challenging that was. And I feel like that's really important feedback for us in healthcare as we take care of kids.
For us, we too have not had very many problems with inclusion. We've basically been able, with his teachers and stuff like that, been able to find a way to adapt things for him to participate in. I would like to just agree wholeheartedly with you, with your experience with subtleties that are said. And I realize that until you mentioned it, I did not realize that I had been doing also. If you read the file or in speaking with his PT or his OT or his doctor, just using other names so that it wasn't, for some reason, the initials MOM after your name don't carry quite the clout that it probably should. So actually, that's a pretty good strategy for us as parents to use, just to get our point across. We have checked with other people, and all of those things actually help us with inclusion.
Thank you.
I think our family needs for inclusion is unique in the sense that I actually am a parent with a disability. I am a wheelchair user, and that always creates its own interesting idea of what inclusion means to my daughter and I. So my daughter does walk and uses AFOs, but it's been a long journey getting to the point of what her mobility is and aligning with my mobility. So oftentimes access and inclusion means how well can we access the space and anything that we're doing. And I typically don't go right to saying my daughter has cerebral palsy. Sometimes I'll bring it up, but I think the part that doesn't help sometimes is if you only give that much information. Cerebral palsy really has such a wide scope of abilities built into it. And if people don't really understand that just saying it doesn't mean that you need to do this one thing, they might kind of lose focus on the individual as a whole and what can make the experience meaningful directly for them. So it's always a challenge though, and I prefer going places with friends who help it make it a little bit more easier if we do run into snags along the way. Hey, mommy.
Thank you. Kind of along these lines, I feel like we've already delved into this a little bit, but if there was something that you could share with other parents, what would that be? It can be across any topic.
I'd say take care of yourself. Yeah, you have to put, it may sound selfish, but you have to put yourself first. Think about, the whole, like when you're in an aircraft, the message that they tell you, put on your oxygen mask so you can take it, you need to do that first. Otherwise, you will not be able to take care of your child. It's very important that you take care of yourself and just take it one day at a time. Sometimes it's hard, but once you focus on taking care of yourself, you're able to breathe and you're able to handle the day. So that's the biggest thing that I learned.
Thank you.
It would be hard for me to kind of pinpoint one specific thing that I wish I could say to other parents, because it's kind of changed for me throughout this journey. Certain times I wish someone would have said, just keep going. You're in survival mode, just keep going. It's okay. Don't sweat the small stuff. Other times I think I would say, what you're going through right now, or seizure meds to kick in correctly, or whatever it is. But I wish somebody would say, just embrace the suck. It's okay. You know, just embrace it. It'll be fine. I think the biggest thing though is just right now, just enjoy the journey. You know, you're along for the ride no matter what. Enjoy the journey and enjoy the ride. Enjoy the view. It'll be okay.
One of the things that I would say is that if you're in a bad day or you think that, oh, is this ever going to end or whatever, but you know that there's a really good day just around the corner. And there's an experience that you're going to have that's going to like make that day such great, and you're going to remember it forever. And so it's just important to not concentrate on the bad things or the negative things that you might be going through or that are happening in your family and stuff like that. But there's going to be really positive days around the corner. And it's important to always keep looking forward.
Thank you.
I think that I would share, and I love what everybody's had to say here, because it's such a perspective that shows positivity along with the struggles that are always there. And I would just say, remember that you're always your child's expert. You're at all of the medical appointments. You do all those, you know, everything for school. You're constantly listening and there for the everyday challenges. You're there for the everyday wins. So even though it seems like there are days that are definitely not shining moments, but those are happening with everybody. They're just on different levels. And I'm actually here because I got involved with a group of moms, and we're called the Madtown Mamas and Disability Advocates, because we are there for any kids who need help with their school, and anything for being an advocate for the parent, because it's okay to need another parent in the room at any time, no matter what you're doing. And being in a group here today, I just find it encouraging. And you embrace that, you know that you're not alone. You always have other people that are going through something very similar. And sometimes there's some place you can reach out to and you just haven't quite found where that is. And sometimes you just need that one question or that one connection. But our group came together only about a year and a half ago. But my daughter's been going through this, for her whole life, and school since 2015. And I did a lot of it, solo, as every parent in here has like the story of pushing on and just kind of getting through it. When you get to a point when you can connect with another family, it's beautiful. And I hope people kind of come back here again and just thrive off of hearing from each other. So thank you. Hey, Mommy.
Thank you. And we have a question from Janet Laguerre, and definitely anyone attending, feel free to type questions for our panel in the chat. She asks, what advice would you give to care providers?
So can you repeat the question?
What advice would you give to care providers? So care providers like outside of the family.
I think I would tell a care provider, like an aide coming, that I'm assuming that's the way they're asking this. Find out from the family as much as you can. Find out from the individual as much as you can, what their likes are, what their dislikes are, what do they need. And then I guess basically just communicate. Think about the questions you would need to ask, and don't be afraid to ask. Don't be afraid to ask questions.
Building relationships is really important too. As care providers, you have to really build a relationship with the person with CP, and then also with the whole rest of the family, because everybody's involved in this. And then how can you help everybody in the family? You know, not just the person that has CP, but how you are part of that whole family now because you're a care provider.
Yeah.
Well, in my case, I'd say I've been fortunate enough. It's family members that take care of him, his older sister and his uncle. So in our case, yeah, I don't think I have much to say when it comes to that.
I think the only thing I would add, kind of build upon those, is that as like, if we're looking at the medical team aspect, is to remember what Hawkins family just said, is that the individual is the one that needs to have the most focus in the room, because the parents are gonna be doing most of the talking, or the caregiver is gonna be doing most of the talking. And that's where all like the technical relay is gonna happen. But you're part of a team. You're a drop in the bucket of all the people that we get to interact with on a daily basis. So that personal connection and making sure that going to see you is something that's a positive and part of an experience that says, we're going to go back and see this person. And even though it's another appointment, it can still be like a reconnection moment.
Thank you. Kind of along that line, from the Hawkins family or Alberta, any advice you'd give to the medical team? I know we've kind of touched on that a little bit previously.
Advice to give to the medical team is that not only talk to us, but talk to ourselves. And because he has a lot to say and a lot of opinions, and especially as they, you know, become verbal, and or just even being able to, even if they aren't verbal, just they do have concerns and needs, and just being able to communicate with them. It's like when we go into an office, he's there, and the good doctors, it seems like they'll talk to him right off the bat. And we're kind of like there as the person that brought him. And
Or the translator.
yeah, or the translator. But they're communicating with him. And especially that gets so important when, like, he's 18 now. So, I mean, you know, for the last several years, he's wanting to make his own decisions and have independence, and just, you know, we have to understand where he's at and the independence that he wants and what is his desires and things like that.
Thank you.
So in my case, I would say with his core medical team, I don't think I have much to say, because we have such a great and special relationship that when it comes to his core medical team, I feel like we're so blessed to have them in our life. And every single day, I just pray that nobody leaves. That's the best part of it. But outside of that, now that's where, you know, we have some challenges, you know, because I remember one time we had to, he had a fracture, and given his condition, he's prone to fractures. So we went to see, we went in and a different doctor came in, and right away they called social services because they thought it was something that we did, you know, and luckily for us, His doctor from the Weissman Center jumped in and said, hey, it's because of his condition, and I'll say that saved us another headache, So I'll say with his core team, we're very blessed. I don't have much to say, but to say thank you to them, and yeah, but outside of that, I think a lot of work needs to be done there. Yeah.
Thank you. I know that Jonathan prepared some answers, and I definitely want to give him or you the opportunity to share what he had potentially wanted to share as part of the panel. So I just wanted to kind of open. I know Abby Marks may have sent you some questions. I don't have access to those. So if there are certain things you wanted to share from what he prepared, that would be fabulous. Thank you.
Jonathan's questions were, a second, I got to take a quick look here. Can you share about friendship and community involvement? And Jonathan said, COVID has taught me a lot about who's important to me and who true friends are. Friends don't have to be the same age as you to be a friend. For all of us and our kids, I'm sure, COVID has been a big thing. And then the other thing that he said about community was how I'm involved in my community is different than how someone else will be involved. I like different things than other people, so I'm going to be involved in different areas than they would be. It was frustrating to me when I was being told what other people considered community involvement. I felt I should be able to choose what I wanted to be involved in. If I can't go to school games with my friends because it's so late at night and it's too cold for me to be comfortable, I can help out at the food pantry in the morning when I'm at my best. I enjoy helping the guys clean up and patch up the roads on the back roads because I'd really rather be outside than at the movies. I'd rather give me a cookout with friends rather than a meeting at a restaurant. Basically, his point was, you can be involved however, and that it's going to look different. He is actually, I can say this, he didn't write this part down, but he has loved turning 18. So because now people have to listen to him. They have to listen to what he really wants. And that's been really important to him. He's been very, very excited to have, I guess, kind of get out of what parents or professionals feel is right for him and to be able to choose what he wants to do. So thank you for allowing us to share what he wanted to say.
Thank you. That's really wonderful. Let's see. Oh, thank you, Alberta. Another question that Alberta shared with us was one thing you would like to tell teachers or schools.
So I'll go first with that one. So in my case, he receives services from home, and we were fortunate enough that he was able to keep his team for quite a long time. He was able to keep at least the same PT, the same OT for a very long time. And the PT and OT were very, very involved in his appointments. Like they would join us at the Weissman Center. So it was very helpful because sometimes the information was a lot, and having her there to contribute to it was such a blessing. So it was really good for us. And I think what the school forgets is that it takes that whole village to help the kid to succeed. And so in my case, like almost I had to write letters downtown. I had to be his advocate. Like it was constant. I had to pick up the phone and just advocate for him. And I don't care how far I had to go. And his doctors were also very helpful. Like whatever letter I needed, they would write supporting documents in order for me to be able to get what he needs. Now, fast forward, transitioning to high school. Since he went into high school, I think he's in the second year now, and he's never received services. Granted, it was right when COVID happened. So we did the transition, and I've been like, right now we're at a standstill. Like, if they had kept the old team, I think it would have been better because they know him better. So they would know how to guide us through it and everything. They transitioned to a new team that's not familiar with him. And the biggest challenge is, like, they were expecting me to teach them, to guide me to do his services. And I was like, I'm not going to do that, because it's literally me doing your work for you. So, and then you get paid for that. I'm not going to do that. I cannot do that. So that's just not going to work. And we're here in October. He still hasn't received services, and we're still going back and forth with it. So I think with the biggest thing that I'll let the school know is sometimes they need to listen to the parents and do what's best for the kid. So that's the biggest thing that I think the school needs to do.
Thank you.
Okay, for us, our school and most of the teachers have been great. I would want them to realize that not every child with CP is the same. I would ask them to work with the parents, to come up with a way to adapt the schoolwork and learning for our child, for your individual child. Don't put them in a box, but be willing to think outside of the box. And then, teachers don't always know how to adapt a lesson plan for our kids, but they do know how to adapt to a certain learning style. So I found that if you know your child's learning style and you can tell the teacher what their learning style is, it's easier to work together with them on how to adapt things.
I would also say that, as was stated already, is that your doctors can be your best advocate for you. Is that if you run into a wall or whatever at the school, a lot of times the doctors or professionals that you've been working with your child's whole life, they're able to help you in writing a letter or contacting them or getting through that. And then I remember back, well, it was probably almost 12 to 13 years ago, Jonathan had a problem getting services, and we were very up against a wall, and because they didn't have anybody to be able to come to our area of the state to be able to do physical therapy. And so we ended up taking him to Madison, and we had them bill the county. And because we were able to do that, we had to have a hearing and all that, and it all worked out. And the thing is we got services from them because they helped us at Madison to be able to work through that hurdle. So there's a lot of times you have to be your child's advocate, and you can use all these other people that are in your child's lives to be able to help you through that, because they will be there to help you. Everybody that's around you and supports you will do lots and lots of things to help you.
I would have to say school's a hot topic. I've been there for, man, I've had quite the experience with that, because when my daughter started, when she was about to transition into 5K, because she went to Head Start first, she actually had all of her services pulled for a full year because of a technical disagreement on when she should go to school. So I started diving in to special ed. I made hundreds of phone calls to start learning more and to try to educate myself on what I should do. And now this many years later, so my daughter's 9, she's in 3rd grade. I sit on some DPI committees. I'm part of the MMSD Special Ed Parent Council. I have the Madtown Mamas and Disability Advocates group. So my voice is all over the place now, but it started off in a very lonely place. But I think that part of the school experience becomes problematic when the word individualized education gets lost, because individualized can literally be catered to whatever that means for that child. And systemically, if the school's not doing it right, that sometimes means that the administration is not giving them the correct tools or the appropriate guidance and or the ability to allow the individuals at that school to really hone in on what individualized programming means, because that's truly different for everybody. And that's I literally do this work every day, and I still run into areas of gray with my daughters sometimes where we really have to have a hard conversation. But I work with other families on a daily basis, either going to IEP meetings with them, I will refer them to other services, or I'll communicate directly with the district. And anybody here who's in Madison, I'm your advocate. Let's go. If you're running into something, I've spent so much time learning about school and everything that surrounds it, and that goes into just like the individual need all the way up to like some legal issues, because that's where school IEPs sit. It's a legal document, so there's a lot of expertise that is really difficult to understand. And since in Madison, we switched over our administration, it has actually changed the game for several parents that I've personally worked with on what an individualized program means for their child. And when you have the whole school from the top down doing that, everybody benefits. Your student, your child benefits, the parents benefit because they're not arguing all the time, and the teachers benefit because they're able to use everything at their disposal, and they actually get to learn how to adapt school curriculum for a child that really needs that little bit of finesse.
Thank you. It's really wonderful to know that you're such a great resource and advocate for other families as well. I did want to give Jazz the opportunity as well, if there's anything she had wanted to pop on and say.
This girl is never without words. I don't know what she'll say. Do you have a question for her? She does good with questions.
Yeah, I was wondering about her friendships that she's kind of built at school and what she does for community involvement, speaking to what the Hawkins family said about it being, individual to each person.
Jazz, what do you like about your school? Did you want to tell everybody?
Well, everybody, a little nervous.
Oh, that's okay. Well, let's focus on school. So at school,
well, what do I do with Miss Jenny at school?
Well, who's Miss Jenny? Maybe you should tell them who that is.
She's my special ed teacher,
And we
do reading, but do we also do with mommy after reading? Oh,
yes.
But we don't see Miss Carr today because she had a doctor appointment, because I saw Miss Jenny to do reading on the phone.
And what's your favorite thing at school?
I don't know. To go lap around.
Oh, so my favorite thing.
My favorite thing to do at school is take a lap around.
Like our runaround time. And what was the second thing that you had said? Maybe she could community,
Mommy.
right?
Hey, mommy.
Good job. Jess,
What's
hold on. Do you want to tell them who's Mr. Austin?
she's my
No,
I
silly.
he's my boxing instructor.
And
I what was that thing that mommy got for us?
well, you could tell him. I got to.
I got to throw bean bags
Mhm.
and kick the soccer ball.
I like to go.
Bike riding.
Mhm. And how about when we go places? My favorite place to go is?
My favorite place to go is the orange park?
To the park that is Brigham Park across the street that has ramps, the orange swings with a full supported back, and we can play together.
In Mon?
Yes.
What is that park called that we went with Miss Anna and Leo and Amber and Maya?
Oh, we went to Enchanted Valley this
We went-
year.
We went to that big slide park that had those swings, and then and then Maya swinged in them, and I was letting her have a turn, and then Anna was helping me get up that ladder.
Yes, that was a very tall ladder.
Yeah,
That was fun, huh?
yeah. And Mama, what was that bracelet called that we went to?
Oh, we'll talk about that later.
Mama, I'm supposed to talk
She likes
about
doing
it.
events, especially for friends.
Thank you. So I want to be conscientious of time and probably start wrapping things up. Last thoughts that you would want to make sure to share with either medical team members or community members who are part of the attendees here.
I would say that I'm just very happy that the research that is being done, because it's going to be helpful for the future, and great things to look forward to. I think so, and I would encourage every parent and that has a child with special needs, or even parents that don't have children with special needs, to be supportive of the research and as much as possible being involved. Jonathan had been involved in a speech study with Wiseman Center for years. I mean, all the way back to, I don't know, probably almost 15 years. So, and he'll continue to be involved in that. So.
I think I would say, thank you for everything that you're doing. It's very appreciative, and I know that once he gets to adulthood, it's going to be a different environment. So I'm hoping that, by then we would have a lot of information, how to navigate, I'll say, adulthood as well. But yeah.
Melissa, could you actually give me the question again? My little talker was talking.
Oh, yeah. I was just asking for kind of last thoughts, whether that's for medical team members or community members as we wrap up.
Big question. I love everybody who has, I really enjoy doing this with other families, like Hawkins family, Anthony and Alberta. It's encouraging always to know that there's other families out there that are literally going down the same pathway in some sense, or that have already been there that you can collaborate with. And just for parents to remember that sometimes when things are overwhelming and you don't need, like, you need your space, you need your you time, there's also times where it is totally okay to relate to somebody that's in your current circle of care to say, I really need help with this, because having that little extra help from a person who can take the stressors off of you, really, it can make a really big impact in your day. Because all the other questions I've seen in the chat too of what we're going through is like, how do you mitigate all these things and how do you deal with all these? And your brain is constantly just doing that all the time. And so if there's ever an opportunity or someone that you can relay that to at any time. If you're just feeling like I just can't possibly get this done, that's okay. And you have a team there for it too. And that's something at Wiseman, we've always known that, because that's part of the team that comes to see you. And even if it doesn't mean it's them, it might mean there's somebody else that's close by.
Thank you so much, everyone. I think we will go ahead and wrap up then. Thank you to everyone who attended virtually. We look forward to hopefully holding this again next year, and hopefully it will be in person. Thank you to our panelists, the Hawkins family, Jazz and Martha, and Anthony and Alberta. And thank you so much to Dr. Gillick for being our speaker today. With that, I think we'll wrap up. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.